Hello again, everyone. I must begin this time by saying how very good your pumpkin paintings are this month. And I'm really pleased that you enjoyed painting them. I thought they were amazing. And I think we learnt a lot from actually painting them this time in such depth because we use so many techniques, and I think it really paid off. So let's continue with using some of those techniques, and this time I'm going to demonstrate some leaf paintings. This is a good time really to concentrate on leaves and to give them more attention because hopefully they're still quite colourful out there. And it was difficult to decide what to actually do this time. There are so many different ways of portraying leaves that I felt that I wanted to show you as much as I possibly could in the time that I have. So what I've decided to do is to paint one spray of leaves, but to use several techniques in the one spray, in the branch. So these are the colours that I'm going to use, and I chose these forsythia leaves because they're so colourful and have many different colours in them, and a great variety of marks and so on. So these are the colours, and I know there seem to be a lot, but there actually are in these leaves, so that will show you the blending technique. Some of you have seen this before, but it is, if you can close in on it, you can be reminded of all the various techniques that can be used to paint leaves. And when you paint your leaves, try to choose the technique that you feel is going to be best for the actual leaf that you choose to paint. So what I've got here is a drawn little branch of these leaves, and each one I'm going to do differently so that you can actually get an idea of how to use the different techniques. But first of all, I just want to show you a good way of drawing these any particular leaf. So I usually start by putting in the central vein. That actually then starts you off in a good way and gives a little bit of movement to the leaf, and that way you only have this side to deal with first and then this side. So that works reasonably well. You can just indicate where you want to put those veins lightly if you want to. And then when you paint this side first, then that side, and your leaf won't end up looking flat and blocked. So that's a good tip, so try to remember it and put that central vein in first. Right, so I'm going to start at the top here and use some of the different colours that I'm actually seeing in these leaves. And I'm putting some water down first. May not do it every time, but I'm working wet on this first one. But I've put the water down, and I'll put consecutive layers of paint down in a similar way, showing the way that the actual veining sits, etc, etc. So if you work in that direction, you'll get a really nice end result. So all sorts of colours, as I've said, in there. This one has bluey green at the base of it, so I'm going to just drop that in first, and I'm using a size 7 brush, series 33. And the technique I'm going to use with this particular leaf is the Graffito, which is the scratching out method, but which will, in fact, give me some strong veins. It's always difficult to decide what to do with veins, and they can be quite tricky to actually depict, because really they can take over your whole work if you're not careful and just be too strong and unnatural looking. So I'm going to use a fine nib. There are other things that you can use, and I'll show you that in a minute. And I'm going to press very, very lightly. And then as my paint dries, these veins that I'm actually drawing in with this pen are going to start showing up. This scratching out can actually be done before you paint or before you put the water on, if you find that easier, but it works either way. But at least if you've painted it, I always feel that you can sort of see better maybe where you want to put those veins. So let's do the other side. So leaves are very forgiving to paint, so you can use all sorts of different colours in that you feel you might like to, and allow them to blend. It's light red that I'm popping on here now, and then some alizarin at the tip here. But there are all sorts of colours in these forsythia leaves, purples, reds, so on and so forth. So I've painted the whole leaf this time because of popping the Graffito on the top. So as I've said, I'm going to show you various methods with each individual leaf. So that's that one. You can also, with Graffito, if you have one of these ruling pens, you can tighten it up so that it's completely closed to make a fine line. But sometimes these veins have, through the centre, a double line. So I've left my little tool with the pincers slightly open, which is actually going to create a double line for me, for that vein in the centre. So let's see, as it dries up, how that turns out. So that's one leaf. The majority of them will have, or I think on this particular lot, a sort of base colour of raw sienna I'm using. I can see yellow showing through on most of these leaves. This particular leaf I've masked the veining off, so that's another method of showing up the veins. Your blending is going to work better if you have time to just allow it to stop shining a little bit first. I haven't got that time, so I'm going to work with that idea anyway, with just popping in the colour as I go. But the masking I've put on is very, very fine, not at all heavy, because I think you have to be really careful when using masking fluid. So I didn't want really heavy, thick lines, so that I would then have to go back and start touching up afterwards. So if you've popped masking down, make sure that you go completely over the marks that you've made with your paint, because otherwise you won't get the marks that you particularly needed in the first place. So this is another technique to show up the veins on the leaves that you're going to paint. There's a little hair or something on there. So if you have something like that, oh no, I think it's a bit of masking that's actually peeling off. So if you have something like that, I suppose it's best to just leave it until till you've allowed it to dry, and then remove it. But using this blending technique is really nice. So let's try the next one without putting any water down first, because that's going to help to keep a nice bright colour going. So this one, I think I'll put some Graffito on first, see how that works out. So let's put, you'll see it, see these marks appearing hopefully then as I paint. Good. Right, so let's go again with the raw sienna, and I'm actually going to work wet on dry with this one and not put the colour all the way, so that I get a nice bright purple, like this one, at the edge of my work here at the top. And where it meets the yellow, it's going to make a lovely orange colour. And as you go along, look for any shine that you might see on your leaves. And when it's still damp, you can lift little bits of shine off. But that's better to be done when your leaf is not completely dry and certainly not completely wet, because if it's very, very wet, the lifting off won't work. It's going to fill in again. So let's paint the other side of this, and let's hope that my little veins are going to show up as I paint. They're beginning to show up where it's drying up here. And if you've got little sort of raggedy edges, look out for those, and make sure that you keep those marks looking right and not too smooth. Right, I think my veins are starting to show up there. Let's see what happens when it's dry. Right, now the other thing I like to do, I particularly like this method, and that is to actually just leave white paper showing. So if I'm painting more loosely, I like to try to show some veins just by leaving white paper. So I've not chosen too large a brush today. Just put the light on. The sun is bright in here, but maybe not quite bright enough. There we go. That's better. Now you can maybe see better what's happening. Right, so I've left a few veins there with the white paper. I'm going to try and do, it's more difficult doing it this way, working in this sort of direction rather than that way if you're right-handed, so you'll have to just be a bit careful about what you're doing there. Right, now let's put a nice colour over the top of that. So my veins are not going to go completely back to white paper everywhere. Some of them are going to show up with the yellow underneath, which is looking quite natural. Make it a little bit deeper, maybe where the central vein is. And some of them are showing up blemishes and things, so I'm going to actually go with that and paint them in, because I like this time of the year to paint things looking natural. Okay, so now let's see if I can leave some, just an indication of some veins. This side of this leaf. So you have to be careful you don't end up with a really stripy appearance. It's only just an indication of those veins. And I've also left here and there little white edge where I've got that central vein. Now this one's been eaten a little bit, so I've got some sepia. I'm actually just going to show up that little edge that's been chewed, and that's going to look quite natural, hopefully. So the way I did that was to actually just go onto the dry paper, which will leave you a harder line, which works quite well. The other thing when you're painting something like this, and lots of one thing, you need to try to end up with layering. So I've got another little leaf behind there that I need to actually quickly show up. So a little bit of overlapping is always going to give nice perspective to your pictures. So try not to leave big spaces between everything. Just a little light painting of a leaf or whatever behind is going to give you a lovely sense of perspective and make your picture look more interesting. So try to work dark against light and light against dark every time. So you don't need to necessarily always follow exactly what you see in front of you. Do what you know best is going to work with your picture to make it look right and for things to stand up out and to have form. So there's a little leaf going on behind there. Maybe it needs a bit of another colour in it as well. Trying to go darker at the edge here where this particular leaf is quite light, which is going to bring this leaf forward and take that one back. So something to look out for. Right, let's try this leaf now. I'm going to put a bit more green in this one, I think. What I tend to do is to study my subject when I'm doing something like this. Study it very carefully, decide what I like and what I think is going to work really, really well with the colours, etc. And then I actually don't necessarily follow exactly what I've got going on in front of me. I tend to just wing it a little bit and do my own thing with the colours. So that's a more organic way to paint, really, and something that works, I think, really, really well with a subject like this. So popping some green on the top there now. And then I think some purple. Looking at something like this one here. It's a lovely bright purple. It's an amazing leaf. There we are. But what I want to do on this particular one is to do some lifting out. So I'm going to let it dry a little bit, that side. And then lift some marks out if I can. If I don't let it go too far, it should work quite well. So I've left a little bit of a light area where that central vein is. And this one again has got some little marks at the edge here where it's been eaten. So some blemishes on there. And also, why not, let's put some blemish between the little veins and things. So now what I want to do is to get a drier, stiffer brush if I can, and see if I can lift off, I haven't left it too late, some veins. So those veins are quite thick actually, so maybe I ought to have found a little brush that's not quite so I needed a finer brush for that really, but what I can do is to just go back in and touch that up. So there's always something you can do to bring things back. So it actually helps perhaps better to actually flatten your brush tip like this, taking some of the moisture out at the same time and just lift. So that didn't work too badly. And you can, as I say, always go back in and just put a little bit more depth beside those veins, which is going to make them show up nicely. Right, so that didn't work too badly at all. Yeah, good one. Right, okay, what's next? Let me think, what could I do now? I've left white paper. Oh, I think what we could do on this one is, can I see a leaf that looks as if it might be all spotty, and pop some salt on? Not really. There was one around, I think that must have got lost or something, thrown out. But anyway, let's go with a little bit of salting on here, on this one, because that's another option when you see that a leaf perhaps has lots of sort of spotty marks on them. That's brown madder, which I think is a lovely colour for autumn leaves. And so again, I've kind of worked in the direction that I see the markings on there. And while that's still damp, I'm going to pop a little bit of salt on. And obviously the darker you make it, the more salty it's going to become. But just sprinkle salt on with your finger and thumb. Don't shake it out of a little pot or anything, because you'll get too much. If you get too much, it piles up and it doesn't work well. So I'm going to put some more depth of colour on here, this side, so that my salting shows up really well. But at the same time, I'm also going to put a few little spotty bits on here. In the way of sort of blemishes, so that when I put my salt on, it's going to make particular marks. So it's all a little bit experimental, but it's great fun to do. There's one I did earlier, similarly, and I felt that worked quite well and looked quite natural. Just so long as it isn't too wet, because if it is, the salt is going to explode a little bit too much and make larger marks that you perhaps wouldn't want. Right, what else could we do? Oh, I know. This one's got lots of eaten marks on there, so the little edge has been eaten, so there's been something crawling all over it at some point, or birds are eating, I don't know what happens exactly. So let's see what happens if we drop in water on this one to make particular marks. I'm going to make this one quite bright because I'm going to move the paint around and I don't want it to become too weak. So keeping that little jaggedy edge, popping some alizarin on here. I don't actually see a leaf quite as bright as this in my spray here, but some leaves are as deep in colour as this, so I just wanted to show you what you could do. So while that's still damp, I'm going to actually get my sword brush. So I've got a very fine tip to use, and I'm going to just drop water on the top to create some blemishes. And see how that dries up. And also use my little trick of showing up where it's been eaten. So there we go, that's hopefully going to dry up looking quite natural. Those colours are the colours that you see in Virginia Creeper, so if you get hold of a Virginia Creeper leaf, you'll need to go as bright and as cheerful as that, which will look really nice. Done the salting. What else could we do? There is one thing which I'm not sure if I can show you completely what I mean today, because I can talk you through it though. It's a matter of painting your leaf one side I wanted that to be a little bit darker really, especially where the vein is. So this has been eaten at the end here quite a lot. So I'm actually just going to stop for a second and dry that, because I want to show you what can happen here if I then paint the other side. Right, now if you have an area that you've allowed to dry in your leaf, and then you want to have a nice dark vein down the centre, rather than to draw a line, which never looks particularly nice, draw a line with your brush. If you actually paint up to that central line that I've got there, edge, you're going to get an automatic dark vein appearing without having painted a nasty line there. Okay, so I'm dropping some water back on here just to make that look a bit more leaf-like. But can you see that nice dark edge that has appeared there? Because what's happened is, when I painted that side, the watercolour came up to the edge and sat there as a little residue. And then when I painted and allowed it to dry, then when I painted just over it, it's getting a double layer of paint on top, which will create a nice line without having to actually draw a particular line with your brush, which looks much nicer. So try to avoid lines around or through your pictures. Painting in veins afterwards with a brush is quite tricky, so I try to use these various techniques to actually get that happening. And I'm now getting sunshine on my work, which doesn't help, but I'm almost there, so not a big deal. I've just got one more leaf there to do, and that's showing you what happens when there's a curl on a leaf. So I'll just use one colour and that's something you see quite a lot obviously in leaves, and especially dried leaves, where you get a little curly edge that's folded over, and people get a little bit confused as to how to actually portray that sometimes. The sun's not helping here, is it? So that's one side of this leaf. Let me paint the other side, avoiding the curled area. And then I'm going to paint that as a separate little section. So using a slightly different colour would perhaps, or tone would perhaps help there. So I'll make it slightly different, and leaves are usually very different on the back side of them. So here we go, emphasising that difference in the colour so you can see my method. So So now that looks like it's curled over. And you can always go back and put a little bit more depth the other side, which would be shadow cast from the little folded over area. Soften edges if you feel you've made a hard edge that you don't like. And it's usually very dark looking under there, that area there. So hopefully that is going to show up okay. Right, now let's just go back and talk about some of the things that have happened here. Wish the sun wasn't shining. Got some salt on there that needs to come off. So that, I think, has ended up looking very natural, the one with the salting. There's some masking on here, which, now that I've taken off, doesn't look too bad. But if you feel that that's a little bit standing out a little bit too much, you can take a very watery light colour and just paint over the top, which is going to just soften it somewhat, okay? Having said that, if you've also got areas in your painting of leaves that you feel aren't quite bright enough, just glaze over the top with a very, very light watery glaze to bring up the colour. It won't disturb what's going on underneath, but it will actually just give a little bit more life. Now I feel here where I actually put this Graffito on after I painted it, I didn't press hard enough. So my little leaves there, my little veins on that leaf didn't really show up too well, did they? So let's see what happens here if I now take my sword brush and try and paint a few in. Not my favourite method by any means. But let's see if I can make a decent job of it. So it's got to be very, very light, and it's got to be very fine. So again, if you feel you've made that a little bit strong, take a wet brush and just work beside it to soften it away a little bit, and it should, when it's dry, look a lot better. As I say, that's not my favourite method, but having said that, there's been some leaves in the studio this week that people have brought that have had veins that really, really are strong and needed to show up really well, and so therefore that, you know, would work very well for something like that. But there is touching up that you can do if you feel you need to with your little sword brush. Often veins look very dark one side and not the other. So once it's dry, it's going to be easier to bring that back up. I think it's improved this leaf, which was looking a little bit flat, I thought. And the veins were looking a little bit too wide. So that's helped with that, I think. But do be careful of not overworking at this stage, all right? So what you could do now is pop a background on if you feel you'd like to, or well, I'll show you some other methods that I've used this week as well. But one thing I think I could show on this one now is to pop a little bit of splattering over the top, which is going to give it another dimension, make it look nice and natural, put some more markings on the leaves. And so that's gone on to dry paper, which is in fact a hard splatter. If I want to soften some of those, I will wet my brush, just clear water and tap again, and this will make some of those little marks disperse, and that's called a soft splatter. Right, okay, so that's a very colourful situation, isn't it? And not necessarily looking like this, but I did just want to show you the various techniques. And I can also show you some other things that you could do. Don't forget salting in the background if you want to. You can use candle wax, you can use a pipette, as we've done in other weeks. So use some of your learnt techniques to create a nice picture this time. I painted these forsythia leaves earlier, and that's what I ended up with. I didn't put background on, but I did actually just splatter a little bit of paint in the background. I used ultramarine blue and some raw sienna, just dotted in here and there just to break up the monotony of the white paper, but really big splatters, so that worked quite well. And obviously they're more realistic colours, but I used the same techniques that I've been showing you today. This one is just a montage, which you might like to do. Just take a little selection of leaves, collect some nice leaves, create a nice focal point, and just dot leaves all around. And that's really good practice. You can try out all the different techniques if you did something like that, and you end up with, I think, quite a nice painting. This is a Virginia creeper leaf, which is a lovely one to do because it's got so many different colours, and lovely practice for your blending. And just one really lovely leaf like that creates a picture. So that's all you would need to do, maybe some splattering on the top. I painted these maple leaves earlier in the week as a demo for class. And with this one, I did pop the background in and allowed it to dry, but then painted more on the top of the background that I originally painted, creating more sort of leaf shapes in the background, just to sort of indicate the possibility that there are more leaves going on around. And a bit of pipetting or painting if you want with a dark colour, some branches and things like that, and some splattering as well. So lots going on in that one, just to sort of create a more natural effect. If you want to create something a little bit more formal, you could perhaps put some leaves in a vessel and paint something like that, but maybe try to choose the right sort of vessel. Nothing too, with these being a sort of informal subject, I think you need a fairly informal looking vessel to put them in. So something like pottery or copper or something like that would look really good. I know these aren't autumn leaves, and we'll maybe go on to holly again at another point, but if you want to sort of start a Christmas card or something like that, using nice dark greens for your holly or ivy, and use salting to create the impression of maybe some snow or ice, and keep it simple, but you've got a nice subject there for a card. So maybe try the holly while it's still got berries. Always create a nice focal point, don't forget that. And I think that's about all for this time. So let's see how my little thing's dried up here. Here's my spray. The splattering's still wet, but it's looking all right. So try some of these techniques. Obviously you don't have to put every one of these techniques in your picture, but just choose what techniques you think are going to be best for whatever it is you're painting. I like what's happened there. That looks very nice, very natural. So as it dries, you're going to see better what you've got. So give it a chance before going in and doing too much touching up. I'll be back again on the 1st of December, and I'll be painting something wintry. Not sure what yet. I'll see what's outside. So have a good 2 weeks and create lots of lovely leaf paintings. Take care. Bye-bye.